Okay, what I wanted to do with this video is introduce one of the early classic war games. So maybe the generation behind us, the younger generation, can appreciate the roots. Now, Gettysburg was really the first historical board war game made in North America. It actually came out in 1958 and was produced by the founder of our hobby, Charles Roberts, for which the Charles Roberts Award is named after. Now, Gettysburg, although it came out in 1958, was reprinted again in 1964, and the 1964 edition was actually my first land board war game which was historical. So the game we're going to be looking at today is really the 64 edition, and I'll explain why we're doing that. There were significant changes from the 58 edition. For one, the counters got better. So let's take a look at some of the components. One of the significant features of the Gettysburg game designed by Avalon Hill was the use of a historical order of battle. In other words, the pieces had the names of the generals on them and were rated for combat, proficiency, and movement. Now, as it turns out, all the Union infantry moves 2, all of the Confederate infantry moves 2, and the Confederate units were divisions, as were the Union. The artillery were in battalions, maybe 5 or 6 batteries, and the cavalry were in single brigades. Now, this is quite new, because games up to that point didn't have named historical units. Now, is the order of battle accurate? Well, no. By modern standards, it is not. So if you add up the factors, let's say for the Union 1st Corps, they're not going to jive with the size of the 11th Corps or the 6th Corps. All that was accurate about the game was really the order of battle for the entire Army. So if you added up all the factors of the Army of Northern Virginia and all the factors of the Army of the Potomac, the ratio of the two armies was about correct. But that's it. So if you looked at, let's say, Pender's division, and it was rated as a 4-2, and compare it to, let's say, Rhodes' division, which was also a 4-2, that's not quite accurate. Rhodes' division was actually slightly larger than Pender's. I think it had 2 more brigades. So within the divisions themselves, the numbers were not accurate. So we had a very broad-brushed, let's say, view of the Battle of Gettysburg with this edition. Now, one neat thing that Avalon Hill did was they took an actual topographical map of the battlefield around Gettysburg and then just threw a grid on it. That had some pluses and minuses to it. By just adding a square grid, it facilitated movement okay, but it could cause all kinds of problems when you went to interpret as to what the terrain was when a unit was on a specific hill. Think of this, well, there's a hill there. I remember arguing over that several times. Or a little knoll over here, you know, is that a hill or isn't it, kind of thing, when you're on the edge there. Let's say, you know, are you on a hill there or over there? So the square grid superimposed over a topographical map brought inherent problems to the game system. And as the hobby developed, very few games used the square grid. The square grid has its uses, but it didn't quite work for the Gettysburg game. Now, for the purposes of the demonstrating some of the components, that's the original sheet of counters. I didn't have the heart to punch out this particular edition, so what I did was I made duplicate counters, and that's what I'll be using in the demonstration. So you're going to see the quality won't be there. That's because these are homemade, but for the purposes of the demonstration, they will suffice. Now, I got into the hobby in 1969. Like I mentioned, this was my first land board war game. My first war game ever was Avalon Hill's U-Boat, but I didn't think that was an appropriate game to start this series, so I started with this one. There were some cool things about the square grid version of Gettysburg. It wasn't all bad. One of the cool things I thought was neat was having the rule whereby the artillery is protected by infantry in the front. As you can see, the infantry division there is on one square, and the artillery battalion is on the same square behind it. And the rules were that if infantry was attacked by other infantry, the artillery was automatically protected. I'll try to give you an example of that. So let's say Robinson's division there in blue was attacking the Confederate division on the hill. No matter what the combat result was, the artillery could not be affected because the Union player did not have artillery. So they were trying to simulate the effects of long-range artillery and how you couldn't really get at it unless you got through the infantry. It was simple, but effective. Now, one of the flaws of this system, kind of out of date, was they had these neat enfilade rules. For example, if the 3-2 unit came in on the Confederate left there and enfiladed it, it got to be tripled in attack factor. So that 3 becomes a 9. Great. But the rules still said that the artillery was protected, which kind of looked ludicrous. But those are the rules. So in this case, you had the 3 becoming a 9, adding up the defense of the 2, the 4 and the 2 is a 6, but technically doubled on a 12. So 9 to 12 is still a 1 to 2 attack. And in a second, we'll take a look at the classic Avalon Hill combat results table. Okay, veterans might remember this table. I believe it was used in Waterloo, Stalingrad, Africa Corps. It was a common combat results table to many Avalon Hill games, from Napoleonic, Civil War, World War I, World War II. It was serviceable. I mean, a 1-to-1 attack was 5 or 6, you got the attacker eliminated. A 1, you got the defender eliminated. 2-to-1 got a little bit better, and 3-to-1, and so on. So it was bloody as hell, and served Avalon Hill for many years. Out of date now. I don't think anybody would seriously design a game using that table, but it did serve Avalon Hill very well for a lot of their games. One little oddity of the game was it included headquarters counters, but they had absolutely no function at all. They were 0-8s, they did nothing. You just put them on the board to look good, and after 10 minutes you kind of got rid of them because they got in the way. But as I'll explain, the 1958 edition was quite different. And there was things about the 64 edition that puzzled me. And I'll get to that in a second. Okay, that's just an overall view of the map again, showing you the Union, the way they might have been set up historically, maybe on July 2nd, showing the fishhook line, and those 3 units coming up the rear of the 6th Corps marching to the battlefield. And you can see the Confederates there over on Seminary Ridge and stuff. But as you can tell, with Confederate divisions and Union divisions, there really isn't enough counters for the Union, or rather the Confederates, to cover the front. So, I mean, it wasn't a great simulation of the Battle of Gettysburg by any means. It was just a fun game for its time. You had the sense that you were moving Union pieces and Confederate pieces in some kind of Confederate, or rather Civil War simulation. But it wasn't a good, accurate simulation of the Battle of Gettysburg by any means. Getting back to those leader counters for a moment, in the original 58 edition, they had little what they called outpost counters, and they were little square things just like the leaders. And you could actually deploy them kind of one square in front of the divisions, and they would act like skirmishers and stuff like that. Very complicated, really, for the time, and Avalon Hill just abandoned it. But getting back to that 58 edition again for a moment, I mentioned something about the movement. One neat thing about the 58 edition, since you could ignore the grid, men could move in column kind of neat. You could just move them up the road, literally on the road, following the road. So you take your little ruler there and move the troops along the road a certain distance. I think it might have been 2 inches, 4 inches, I forget. So columns kind of looked like columns as they moved. So it had this neat look. It looked like a lot of the maps you see in historical books, but it didn't play quite that way. By the way, without the grid, how did you have combat? Well, you actually measured the distance between the two divisions. I think it was 1 inch. You got a little wee orange template, and you put it between the two counters, and if they touched, then those units were considered to be in combat. But it was complicated for the time, and I can see why Avalon Hill eventually abandoned it. Not much else to say about the game, except that we played it so much we actually wore the counters out, and later on I developed a brigade level system for it, ordered blank counters from Avalon Hill and made brigades, and we played the hell out of this thing. But my son and I tried playing it just a few years ago, just for old time's sake. He had never played it, and well, there wasn't much play value to it. It was like, you know, playing a little quaint Parcheesi game, let's say from the 1940s or something. It was like a little piece of history. But I will always remember the game with affection. So I just wanted to introduce to you the 1964 edition of Gettysburg for those who hadn't played it or seen it. Well, I don't know what else to say about the 1964 edition of Gettysburg, except that it lasted well into, I think, the early 70s when it finally went out of print. Avalon Hill finally came out with a 1977 edition of Gettysburg, which I'll probably do a little bit of a review later. I just wanted to highlight this game and just remember it as kind of a game from my childhood, and give it the respect that it's due. So thank you, Mr. Roberts, for creating Gettysburg, 1958 edition.